as the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 tops 560,000, and Brazil records over 4,200 deaths in a single day. We begin today's show looking at how Cuba has successfully fought the pandemic. Since last year, only about 440 Cubans have died from COVID-19, giving the island one of the lowest death rates per capita in the world. Cuba's also developing 5 COVID-19 vaccines, including 2 which have entered stage 3 trials. Eduardo Martinez is the president of Cuba Pharma.
We are very confident that our vaccines will be effective, the vaccines that are being developed. The results that we have had to date point to satisfactory results, and we maintain that before the end of 2021, our population will be immunized with the vaccines that we're developing. Given the blockade that we are subjected to and the situation in the country, it would have been very difficult for us to get the results that we are getting in the fight against the pandemic if we had not developed this industry more than 35 years ago in our country.
For decades, Cuba has heavily invested in its medical and pharmaceutical system, in part because of the 6-decade-old U.S. embargo that's made it harder for Cuba to import equipment and raw materials from other countries. In the 1980s, Cuba developed the world's first meningitis B vaccine. It's also developed important cancer drugs that are now being used in the United States and elsewhere. In a moment, we'll go to Havana. But first, I want to turn to an excerpt from the recent online documentary series, The War on Cuba, produced by Belly of the Beast, an independent media group in Cuba. One episode looks at Cuba's efforts to fight COVID-19 at home and abroad. It's narrated by the Cuban journalist Liz Oliva Hernandez.
Every morning, tens of thousands of doctors, nurses, and medical students take to the streets across Cuba. They are on the front lines of our fight against COVID. Talia Ruiz is a first-year medical student.
I don't feel afraid. If we are careful and take the necessary measures, we won't get infected. There are doctors who have faced the disease head-on, and they haven't gotten sick. For example, my dad. Hi, Dad.
Talia's father, Juan Jesus, is a family doctor who works at a small clinic next to their home. In March, he joined a group of Cuban doctors on a medical mission to Lombardy, Italy. At the time, Lombardy was the global epicenter of the pandemic.
The number of cases overwhelmed the health system there. We helped the medical personnel who could no longer handle so many cases, and we saved some lives. As we walked to the farewell ceremony, from every home, people came out and applauded us. It was the best feeling I've had in my life. That's why you go on missions.
It wasn't the first time Juan Jesus risked his life far from home. He's part of the Henry Reeve Brigade, Cuba's medical special forces.
Henry Reeve was a soldier from the United States who fought for Cuba against the Spanish in the 1868 war. The brigade was formed in 2005. A hurricane called Katrina destroyed New Orleans. There was a huge number of deaths. Cuba offered to send 100 doctors to work alongside U.S. doctors. We were ready to go.
George W. Bush rejected Cuba's offer to help New Orleans. Since then, Juan Jesus has treated survivors of natural disasters and epidemics around the world.
That's an excerpt from the video series The War on Cuba, which was produced by Belly of the Beast, an independent media organization in Cuba founded by journalist Reed Lindsay, who joins us from Havana, where we're also joined by Dr. Rolando Perez Rodriguez, the Director of Science and Innovation at Cuba Pharma, which oversees Cuba's medicine development, including the development of COVID-19 vaccines. He's also the founder of Cuba's Molecular Immunology Center and a member of the Cuban Academy of Science. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Dr. Rolando Perez Rodriguez, why don't you talk about the latest vaccines, 2 of which are in trial 3. Soberano 2 is one of them.
Good morning. I would like to thank you for this invitation to share with you our experience in facing COVID-19 pandemics. I had to say that we have the first case of COVID-19 in Cuba was reported on March 11, 2021. And in April this year, we decided to start this COVID vaccine project, several vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine project. And in August 13, we already got the first approval to start phase 1 clinical trial with the first vaccine candidate. So in very short time, we succeed to get to clinical development of this candidate vaccine. Today we have, as you said, 5 different vaccine candidates in clinical development, 2 of them in phase 3 clinical trials. 3 of these all of these candidate vaccine used as antigen the receptor binding domain of the spike protein that which bind to the cell receptor. So this antigen is expressed in different technology platform. 3 of the vaccine use the recombinant protein produced in mammalian cells, and the other 2 in yeast. But all of these vaccines we are developing now, we use a platform technology that are very safe, are subunit vaccines. All the formulation also benefit from all the technology we have used in Cuba for a previous prophylactic vaccine, so are very safe. We have long experience with this kind of technologies, and that's the reason we can really go so fast to clinical development.
Cuba will be the first country in Latin America to develop vaccines, this despite the U.S. embargo. Can you talk about why you think Cuba is so far ahead?
No, I had to say that we in Cuba we make a huge investment, in biotechnology last century. By the 80s of last century, we start developing a biotech industry so early, maybe, and then in combination with a healthcare system that is free, is universal, full coverage, and this combination of biotech industry and a good primary care system. I think that combination made possible to accelerate or have impact of all these biotech products in the healthcare, and provide us the experience and the capacity to make so fast development of this vaccine project and to introduce in the health care system.
Why do you think Cuba has far surpassed the United States when it comes to COVID-19 and people surviving? I mean, the U.S., per capita, I think Cuba has something like over the year between 40 and 60 times less the death toll per capita than the United States. How is this possible with the U.S. being the wealthiest country in the world and in the U.S. imposing this massive embargo against Cuba, which is not only stopping U.S. support for Cuba, but countries around the world?
No, it's what I tried to explain before. That is a combination of a national pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical industry, but also how we organize the healthcare system in Cuba. That is free, universal, full coverage, with access to all the population, and also this health primary care system that is looking for, for people with disease. So we are not expecting the people come to the healthcare system. We are looking for the people. So it's a very active and preventive approach to the healthcare. And I think that this kind of organization made possible that with not so much resources, you can have a big impact on healthcare. That is the reason might be the way we organize all these healthcare system.
I wanted to bring journalist Reed Lindsay into this conversation, who has put out this series, founder of Belly of Beast, called The War on Cuba. If you can talk about overall during the time of COVID, even beyond the vaccines, what Cuba has done, what you document in your film series, like sending doctors to places like Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, and beyond.
Thanks a lot, Amy. I was in Haiti for 5 years, and that was my first direct experience with the Cuban doctors, and I found it remarkable what the Cuban program in Haiti was doing. It wasn't only bringing Cuban doctors to work in the poorest areas of Haiti, it was also training Haitian doctors in Cuba. And Cuba at that time was graduating more doctors than the public universities in Haiti. And they were returning to Haiti and working there. And in a sense, it was brain drain in reverse. And living here in Cuba, my doctor is just a block or two away. If I have any problem, I walk down there. It's free. I don't have to show any papers. And that's what it's like for healthcare. It can be a little shocking not having to go in and fill out forms and showing your insurance and everything. And of course, when COVID hit, I knew that Cuba would be prepared, and I felt safer here, frankly, a lot safer than I did if I had been in the United States. I remember telling my mom, who's often been worried about different places I've been in around the world, I told her now I was more worried about her than she was about me.
I want to turn to another excerpt from your film, The War on Cuba, about Brazil's far-right President Jair Bolsonaro expelling thousands of Cuban doctors in 2018.
Bolsonaro has always followed the U.S. president. They call him the Latino Trump. The U.S. wants to cut off the income to choke the Cuban economy, to try to bring about a political change here on the island. When Cuba left the program, around 1,700 municipalities were suddenly left without doctors. I had a patient in Brazil, a 70-year-old man, illiterate. He made an appointment so he could say goodbye. He cried right here on my shoulder.
Millions of Brazilians in poor communities were left without health care. It was just the beginning. Ecuador's president became a Trump ally, and then, in November 2019, he expelled hundreds of Cuban doctors. That same month, a U.S.-supported coup ousted Bolivian President Evo Morales. Bolivia's de facto government immediately took aim at the Cuban doctors.
The false Cuban doctors.
They said we weren't doctors. They accused us of being criminals.
Joandra Muro was head of the Cuban medical mission in Bolivia.
They threatened to burn down the Cuban doctors' homes. They took others to Interpol. They pointed guns at 2 brigade members. They strip-searched some of our women.
That an excerpt from The War on Cuba. Reed Lindsay, a founder of the Belly of the Beast production that made this series. Now, this is very interesting what's happening in Brazil. And if you can talk about the effects of this. I mean, we just reported that 4,200 people died in Brazil just yesterday. That's over 10 times the number of Cubans who've died during the entire pandemic.
Yeah, and in doing this series, we spoke with numerous doctors who were part of Cuban doctors who were in Brazil, and they were hurting because they knew that these communities that they were helping, they weren't able to help, and that they were suffering. People were dying of COVID. What that was part of Trump's policies to crush the Cuban economy. because Cuba sends doctors to other parts of the world, like Haiti. There are many cases where there's really no evidence it's anything but altruistic. But it also sends doctors to places like Brazil, and Cuba receives some money for that, and they use that money to subsidize healthcare in Cuba. And so the Trump administration went after these programs to try to basically hurt the Cuban economy. And it wasn't the only thing they've done. What's really remarkable about the vaccines and what Cuba's achieved in the last year is that Cuba right now is undergoing a severe economic crisis. And in part, it's because of COVID. Obviously, there's no more tourism, and Cuba depended greatly on tourism for its economy. But even before then, there were people who were comparing the economic situation in Cuba to the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was considered worse than the Great Depression. And the reason was because of U.S. sanctions. Now, the embargo's been around for decades, but under Trump, those sanctions became far, far worse. And, that's really the story we were trying to tell with the war in Cuba. I feel it's important to point out that this is a project. What's really unique about Belly of the Beast, and I'm very proud of being a part of it, is that it is a collaboration between U.S. journalists and filmmakers and Cuban journalists and filmmakers. Most of the people in Belly of the Beast are young Cuban journalists and filmmakers. They're telling stories about U.S. intervention in Cuba for a young audience in the United States. And we feel that's really important because people in the United States are at the forefront of pushing for change and policy in the U.S., but they don't always get information about the impact of U.S. policy in other parts of the world, such as Cuba. Not only how that policy is affecting Cubans, but also how that policy affects people in the U.S. And you cited an example earlier. Cuba produces life-saving drugs that cannot be obtained in the United States because of the U.S. embargo.
Let me go back to Dr. Rolando Perez Rodriguez. What plans does Cuba have for your vaccines, like Soberano? How do you plan to use it? And as with doctors, do you plan to export this vaccine? And how many people have participated in trials in Cuba?
Okay, we are expecting to get the result of the phase 3 clinical trial by June. So if we have already the clinical data for efficacy of this vaccine, we should get an authorization for emergency use for the Cuban regulatory agency. And then we can start the massive immunization program in our country. But in parallel, with this phase 3 clinical trial that involve more than 80,000 people, because Soberana, a candidate vaccine, or vaccine candidate has a clinical trial that should include more than 44,000 people, and the other vaccine, candidate vaccine, Abdala, has a clinical trial that should include 48,000 volunteers. So, but in parallel to this clinical phase 3 clinical trial, we are also making clinical studies at population scale in risk groups, population group. For example, the healthcare workers, all people that are facing the disease directly. And then we, in this personal, medical, doctor, nurses, and employees, we are also now making a clinical study. All this data from phase 3 and the clinical data in this a population, a clinical study that is like a real world, because in that kind of study you will have not only the efficacy, but also how effective will be the vaccine in somehow stop the virus transmission, not just preventing the disease. We should have enough data by June to have this emergency use authorization from the Cuban regulatory agents.
I want to go to the U.S. administration approach to Cuba. During his campaign, President Biden promised to lift current restrictions on remittances and travel to Cuba, but it remains unclear if he's going to pursue resetting relationships with the island. Last month, White House spokesperson Jen Psaki said a shift in U.S. policy on Cuba is not a priority for Biden, adding his administration is reviewing Trump's designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is Biden speaking to a crowd in Broward County, Florida, just days before the 2020 presidential election.
We have to vote for a new Cuba policy as well. This administration approach isn't working. Cuba's no closer to freedom and democracy today than it was 4 years ago. In fact, there are more political prisoners, and secret police are as brutal as ever, and Russia, once again, is a major presence in Havana.
So that was Biden right before the election. Of course, during the Obama-Biden years, they were normalizing relations with Cuba. Reed Brody, we're going to end with you. Reed Lindsay, we're going to end with you. If you can talk about what the effect of these U.S. sanctions has been on Cuba and what it would mean if those sanctions were lifted.
And as I mentioned, Cuba is going through an unbelievable economic crisis. And the sanctions have been absolutely devastating. And they've taken on every part of the Cuban economy. They blocked oil shipments from Venezuela. There was an energy crisis in Cuba. They blocked remittances. If you wanted to send me some money in Cuba, you wouldn't be able to do so. You no longer can send money via Western Union. They basically stopped all investment. They've called Cuba a state sponsor of terror. They've stopped all U.S. tourism. Even if there wasn't COVID, there'd be no U.S. tourists coming here. Basically, Biden is, although he said that he was going to implement a new Cuban policy, has not shown that he will. And just yesterday, Juan Gonzalez, who's the for the National Security Council that runs point on Latin American policy, told CNN, quote, Biden is not Obama in Cuba policy. And he said that that the administration would not invest the political capital necessary to change policy towards Cuba. The Biden administration is being pressured by powerful Cuban Americans. The Cuban Americans are the chairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They're getting a lot of pressure, and they're just not interested in changing policy. At least so far, they've shown they're not. So far, it's status quo as far as policy towards Cuba.